Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another Korean experience type of video. So, what we are going to do right about now is we're going to deviate a little bit from the kids and everything, but we're going to get down to naming conventions. That is the big thing. We're going to get back to the events surrounding my kids at school. We're going to get back to that thing. But right now, we got to get back down to naming conventions and perhaps the story of this. So, we I've told you before, I've done about 4 lesson preparations in my entire time there. One of them was the introduction thing with regards to the kids. At some point, I even taught the teachers some English. We'll get to that. But with regards to the kids, I had 4 lessons planned, to be perfectly honest. One of them was the introduction, and 2 of them was the when they had like the whole, hey, let's see how well your teaching skills are. Mainly because I'm good at winging stuff and I'm good at doing stuff unless it's really important. And what the funny thing is, with me winging the lessons made it always more fun. I eventually wrote down essentially my lesson planning was essentially a rough guideline of what I wanted to do. I had some other books that I can look at to gain inspiration, but most of it was like I'd look at the book and I'm like, cool, this is sort of what they want me to do. I'm going to change that and do it this way. So we had sort of a structure, or I had sort of a structure, but concrete lesson planning never generally took place. So we're going to get down to the name on my arm. We're going to get down to that story. And then I'm going to get down to one of the ways I sorted out problem kids and problems in the class. So, first of all, I get to school in January 2015-ish, right? I get to school and I'm like, round about in the middle of January 2015, or the beginning of January 2015. And I'm like, today is the day where I'm going to rock it and I'm prepared for my lessons and everything. And I get to my class, I've had lunch. School was, the people were a bit weird. They were pointing at me a lot more, the students and everything. And they were literally like, okay, so how are we gonna do this? How are we, they were looking at me, talking amongst themselves. I don't mind. It's Koreans being Koreans, kids being kids, teachers being teachers, whatever. And oh, what was my teachers? Okay, so there's a big story behind this. So I had Suyeon as my co-teacher, but the actual co-teacher was someone else. Man, I'm gonna get her name eventually, but anyway, she's my age, and she wasn't there because she was expecting her baby. She was expecting a kid, so she wasn't there at all. So for the first 3 or 4 months, but she eventually came back and she took over from Suyeon. And whenever she had to go, I had to go somewhere or do something, I talked to Suyeon. And man, I'm so sad that if I see her face, I'll be like, that's your name. If I meet her, I'm like, aha, I remember you. So if you're watching this, dear co-teacher, I'm sorry. It's 6 years later, okay? It's been a while. You probably forgot me too. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe. And anyway, so I'm getting ready for my class after lunch. And I'm pretty sure it was Mr. Taesung that, getting ready for class, the kids walk in, they teacher, no class. And I'm like, what? They're like, no class, teacher. And the other co-teacher, man, I'm going to find her name. She's somewhere on my Facebook. And she comes up and she's like, no, we've got something to tell you. And I'm like, okay. So the class sits there, and some extra kids from other classes come in and they sit down as well. And this kid Taesang comes up to me, and he's like, and he's also the best English speaker kid at that moment in the school, and he's like, teacher, your name. And I'm like, I give him my name. He's like, no, teacher, your Korean name. And I'm like, okay, my Korean name. And he starts writing 2 Korean phrases on the board, right? The backstory is I'm going to show you the thing after everything has been written down. But he writes down Korean phrases, and then he asks me to sound them out, and then he'd write that on top of it. And he'd write it like on the 2 phrases, and then he'd explain to me what they meant. And he was like, yeah, we've got you your names. And the first one is Sa Tae-in, and the second one is Sa Ja-hu. And I'm like, okay. So they write it down. Let me show you what happened. Let me show you what this was the end result. Let's see if I can make it a little bit bigger. There we go. So those are the 2 phrases he wrote. And he's like, teacher, we decide on a name, but 2 names. So you decide. And I'm like, okay, no, you know what? And the one was Sa Tae-in and the other one is Sa Ja-hu. And I was like, okay, what do they mean? And he's like, oh, Sa Tae-in, big man, iron man, strong man, lion man. And I'm like, okay. Warm, and the second one, he's like, yeah, warm lion, important, something like that. And I'm like, okay, cool. And I look at the class, and I'm like, oh, and as I'm pronouncing it, Sa Tae-in, the class was like, oh, he can read. I've been a year in Korea. I can read the basics. And I turn to the class. I'm like, you vote. And they start voting. And they voted on Sa Tae-in. And I'm like, that is my name. Now, in the Western conventions, it's Tae-in Sa. It's my name and then my surname. Tae-in Sa. So it's like, okay, cool. That is my name. And ever since that, they've referred to me as Tae-in teacher. Tae-in teacher. Tae-in teacher. Tae-in Sam. Tae-in Sam. And that was how I've officially gotten my Korean name. And it turns out, I found out like a day or what afterwards. No, I found out on the same day. My co-teacher at the time, she came up to me and she's like, the entire school literally worked the entire day to get your name. And just before you came in, just before lunchtime, we've decided on these 2 names. And we decided you're going to choose them. And like immediately after that, like I got a little bit teary-eyed and I was so proud and everything. And immediately after that, the principal and the vice principal started calling me Tae-in. Tae-in Nim, And I'm like, okay, that is freaking awesome. I've got my Korean name. And the feeling from the school that I've gotten the whole time that I was there was that I am one of them. And it's been through a multitude of actions. I've been like, they told me, listen, we've got a sport day in Gochang where we're playing soccer and everything, and we're doing the sport like competitive stuff. You can come if you want to. And I'm like, I'll be there. Or like, hey, I found out like about 4 or 5 months after, like they do volleyball every Wednesday. And I'm like, I'll be there. But they like, don't you want to go home? I'm like, no, I'm fat. I'm going to play volleyball with you guys. So we played volleyball every, 90% of the Wednesdays after then. And I was so glad to be included. Even so that they would do they would phone me, and my co-teacher would phone me, and she's like, listen, you don't have to come in tomorrow. Tomorrow we have an end of term thing, or we have a certain celebrations thing. You don't have to come in. And I'm like, no, I'll be there. And because of that, I think the school wanted me to stay for longer and wanted me to, they basically saw me as one of them. And now we're going to get to the naming conventions, right? So, as with all schools and everything, there's been, there's bullying and kids being rough with each other and calling each other names and everything. And I don't know when this happened. This might have happened about 7 months into my. Actually, no, it happened before 6 months in. And it was, no, it was about 7 or 8 months. Sorry, it was about 7 or 8 months. And there was a lot of bullying going on. And there's this one kid that was picked on because he was of Mongolian descent. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, you know what? Because I asked them and they like, oh, teacher, he dirty, he Mongolia. And I'm like, oh, crap. Oh, crap. So I remember the one day, and this was just out of the blue. The one day I was like, looking at the class, asking for someone. And I decided I'm going to call out this kid from Mongolia, right? From Mongolian descent. And I'm sitting there. And I'm drawing something on the board. I can't really remember what it was, but I draw something on a board and I've like left spaces open for them to fill in words. It would be like good, blank, blank are you, blank fine, and you. So it's easy for them. They'd be like, oh, we recognize patterns. And I turned to the class, but it was something like this. I'm busy writing on the board like this, right? And I turn around and I just look over the class. So they were grade 3. I just look over the class and I'm like, I don't look at him. I'm like, Mr. Mongolia, come to the front. Come here. Mr. Mongolia, come here. And I point the marker. And they are like, looking at each other, like, who are we? Who's he talking about? And I scan over the classroom again. I'm like, Mr. Mongolia, please come here. And I stop my gaze at him. I'm like, Mr. Mongolia, come up to the classroom. And the class, come up to the front. And the whole class went quiet. And he's like, huh? I'm like, Mr. Mongolia, come. I'm like, what's here? And he's like, oh, hello. And he starts writing. And I'm like, oh, Mr. Mongolia, yes, Mr. Mongolia, good job. And he goes and sits down. And I wait a few seconds, and they start talking amongst each other. And they're like, Mr. Mongolia? Oh? And they look at the another kid that's also been bullied quite a bit. And they look at him, and they're like, Mr. Philippines. And he's like, yeah, Mr. Philippines. And it started spreading. There was a Miss Pretty. There was a Miss Artist. We'll get into those names, or especially Miss Artist, because that's to do with something else, another story. And then there was eventually a Mr. Soccer, and there was a Mr. Badminton. We'll also get into his story. And there was a lot of there was a Miss Tall, I know that. And there was a lot of nicknames made from that. And I could see, the moment I called him Mr. Mongolia, that his self-confidence boosted out. He had a massive self-confidence boost. And that is how I sort of feel like I've helped curb, taking something negative that kids put on other kids and flip it around and showing it as a positive trait. And we had a Mr. Canada. We had, we've had a lot of cool names. And that is how I turned sort of bullying or kids being rough on each other verbally into a good thing. And kids would walk up to me, it's like, oh, you know my name? And at that stage, I knew their names, or most of them. I'm like, oh, yeah, it's so and so and so. And they're like, no, I am Miss Pretty. I'm like, cool. And the kids, like, chose the names and everything. So, yeah, that is how I got my Korean name, and how I sort of how I think I sort of improved or lessened the bullying aspects in school. And later on, you'll see a couple of images where there are literally written Mr. Philippines and something on the whiteboards like Mr. this or Miss this or whatever. And it's because of that. Once I get to those things, you'll see it. And it's because of that one incident where they just decided they're going to give each other awesome English names. And they also did realize that they're actually giving each other awesome English names based off of what they were bullied about. Okay, I don't know so much about the Miss Pretty thing, but apparently, yeah. And then there was a Miss Pretty 2 and something like that. So it's interesting. But yeah, that was my naming conventions and everything. Another thing is also, I went up to the teachers just with the naming conventions thing quickly. This is going to be a long video. Just with the naming conventions, I asked if they wanted English names. And I've asked their permission. And the kids generally agreed, like, they don't want English names. So I had to remember them with their Korean names, and it was quite difficult for me in the beginning. That's why a lot of the names I don't remember. I don't remember because it's like, if I see your face like, teacher, I'm this, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember you. You did this and this and this, But the whole turning the whole finding that whole, oh, they're being bullied about this, let's change it into something positive, like that whole thing. And that was sort of like one of my biggest wins, was that whole turning something negative into a stronger trait. And we'll get to Mr. Badminton next. I think we're going to do that. Mr. Badminton, Mr. Soccer, and Miss Artists. Enough content for another video. Maybe it will be 10 minutes. But yeah, thank you everybody for watching. And I'll see you in the next Korean TaLK experience. Until then, have a good one.